This is video 8 on subsistence systems. So we're going to talk about 3 kinds of subsistence systems, and basically the word subsistence refers to how a group of people feed themselves, how they subsist. So first we'll talk about foraging, then we'll talk about small and large-scale agriculture. And we'll be thinking about how to compare and contrast these subsistence systems and the ways of life that sort of seem to accompany them. I asked you to read either the article on the Junhuazi or the article on the Nur. So think about the reading that you did in terms of the aspects of life that we'll discuss. And then together on Thursday, we'll sort of share information about those 2 readings with one another and further the comparison and contrast. Okay, so the first thing to think about as we go through this is even though subsistence systems are about food, they're really not just about food. They're about politics, economics, and just about everything else. And indeed, some earlier anthropologists really felt that subsistence system will, in large part, determine your social organization and the way of life that you have as a society. It's actually more complicated than that, but mentioning that gets at the central importance of subsistence system to all these other aspects of culture. So first, let's look at foragers. Foraging is basically hunting and gathering. It should probably be called gathering and hunting because almost all foragers eat more calories and spend more time gathering than hunting. So the Junhuazi, and by the way, their name is difficult to pronounce, and I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Their language includes click sounds like k. So the actual pronunciation is something like the Junhuazi, but that's difficult. So I sort of gloss it as the Junhuazi. They live in southern Africa, so they're in the countries of Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa for the most part. And just to give you some pictures, you may not have read this article, but I thought you'd enjoy sort of seeing their way of life. So women do the majority of the gathering, which makes up about 75% of the diet. And they are able to, in this, savanna grassland, not the easiest place on earth to live, they're able to identify and find over 100 species of plants of all different kinds and eggs. Men do the hunting, and that makes up about 25% of the diet, and they're able to identify and hunt and track 240 animal species, all kinds of bird species, reptiles, and amphibians. Their tracking skills are world-renowned. In fact, there are a lot of American hunters who will go and train with the Junhuazi to learn how to use signs in the environment to track and kill animals. So the Junhuazi can, see tracks or see evidence that animals have moved through a space, and they can figure out the type of animal, how many there are, the sex, age, health, diet, the speed they're moving, the time they were there. They're expert trackers. So they're able to brilliantly exploit the resources of this environment. So if you read this article, I'd like you to think about the following things about the Junhuazi and be prepared to talk about them in our discussion on Thursday. So first of all, how do they live in their environment, and how does that affect their diet and mobility? How do they spend their leisure time? How do they seem to be organized or not according to family, politics, economics? Do they have a lot of conflict, and what do they do about it when there is conflict? And some idea of how sort of complex their religious beliefs are. The other article was about the Nur, who are small-scale agriculturalists. So small-scale agriculture is the second subsistence system we'll look at, and it involves the domestication of plants and animals. So horticulture is the name for the domestication of plants. And that can take the form, horticulture can take the form of what's called swidden horticulture, which is much more sort of temporary and mobile. For example, a group might cut down or burn down some portion of the forest and plant crops there for 2 or 3 years until the soil is no longer good, and then they'll move on and burn down or cut down the next part of the forest and start all over again and leave the previous area alone for years to regenerate. Farming is much more settled, more permanent agriculture, such as we're familiar with living in Pennsylvania, where we have farming all around us. So that's the domestication of plants. Pastoralism is the word we give to the domestication of animals. So pastoralists have animals, keep animals, and herd animals. Now, what's interesting is most people who are small-scale agriculturalists will do both horticulture and pastoralism, but they're primarily identified with one of them. So the Nuer are a group of people who live in Central Africa, mostly live in the new country of South Sudan, which broke off from Sudan after years of sustained conflict. And here's just an idea of, what their housing looks like, which is described in the article, and also the prominent role of cattle in their life. As you can see, cattle, they're living with their cattle. Here's another picture of Nuer with cattle. Cattle are all around. The cattle are all important. In fact, an anthropologist who studied them most famously, E. Evans Pritchard, said their very social idiom is a bovine idiom. They talk about themselves in terms of their relationships with their cows. A man tells a woman he's courting that she's beautiful by comparing her to his favorite cow. Cows are traded in order to establish family relationships, etc., etc. So again, for those of you who read the Nuer article, be prepared to talk on Thursday about the same things. So for a pastoralist society, as exemplified by the Nuer, how does pastoralism come from their environment? How does it affect their diet, their mobility, their leisure time? How do they organize themselves around pastoralism? Does it create conflict, and how do they resolve that conflict? And how complex do their religious beliefs seem to be? So again, we'll make these comparisons and contrasts in class. Hint, here's one aspect of what we'll do in this discussion about the two societies. The Nuer have more property than the Junwazi do. So foragers are famous for not having a lot of property, because when you're moving around all day, every day to find food, you can't really carry a lot with you. And when you deplete the environment in a certain place and have to move on to another place shortly thereafter, you can't really take a house with you, you can't take luggage, you just can't take a lot of stuff. So they tend not to have a lot of stuff, which really affects their economy, their politics, their family organization, the level of conflict that they experience, and lots of other stuff too. The Nuer, by contrast, they own a little something. They own cattle. So we start to see a very different level of organization of politics, economy, family organization. We see more conflict because there's more to fight over, and so forth and so on. So as we make this comparison and contrast in class on Thursday, we'll really look at the role of property. Property meaning not just land, but goods that one owns, goods that one possesses and has to carry around with one and has to protect from others. Okay? So property, it turns out, was one of the defining characteristics in the stages from savagery to civilization that we looked at in social evolution, as illustrated by Henry Louis Morgan, the American anthropologist who was a social evolutionist. So property is something that anthropologists have been thinking about for a long time. And we'll also ask ourselves on Thursday, have we put too much emphasis on property as some kind of vast difference between groups of people? Okay, so be ready for that on Thursday. One last thought I want to leave you with is that as we move to large-scale agriculture, that's the third subsistence system we're looking at, which often becomes an industrial society that's sort of moved even beyond large-scale agriculture, we see a magnification of some of these differences. So I want you to think about your experience in American society, and as we talk about these things on Thursday, be prepared to sort of comment about how large-scale agriculture and an industrial society magnifies these things even more. So be prepared to talk about our diet, mobility, leisure time, kinship and social organization, political economic organization, level of conflict, complexity of religious beliefs, and so forth.